Upon opening the door, I saw the most horrifying scene of my life. Slumped at his kitchen table, this giant of a man was too weak to lift his head. He had lost at least 30 pounds since I had last seen him 3 weeks prior. I asked Richard, why hadn't he called the doctor? He said, because I knew you were coming. That's when I realized this man's life was in mortal danger and I had to do anything to keep him alive. Who was this person? Richard Taruskin, the world-renowned music scholar and New York Times author. Revered, reviled, and respected by millions. But he had become to me my dearest friend and closest emotional support. This had happened over 30 years ago when I was a student at university. In fact, I did everything to avoid getting to know the man, for he had an uncompromising reputation as a professor who would eat you alive. I will never forget the words he wrote on one of my friend's papers. Mr. Halley, you suffer from omnidirectional rage. You need to seek professional help. This is the man I avoided until my last year, but when I dove into his class, I was greatly rewarded. I came to love the material and the person who taught it. Years later, in 2008, I received an email from Taruskin. I had recently sent him my CD, my first solo CD, and I was very excited and nervous to read what he had written me. I opened it. It said, "No minimalist is as macho as you, Belinda. The first and the last pieces are as good as it gets. Congratulations, you are a real composer. Your old prof and fan, RT." Years after that, I was dismayed and so worried to hear that he had had an emergency bypass operation. I immediately sent him an email, teasing him, saying, "This is not the way to get my attention." He wrote back quickly, glad to hear from me, and we began a pen palship. Soon, he invited me on a convalescent walk by the bay. I was excited and nervous and scared, for I had held this man on a pedestal for years as my mentor and former professor. However, I needed not be afraid, for when he showed up, the conversation was natural and easy, and in fact, we began weekly walks and lunches that lasted over 10 years. We discussed everything from music to politics to religion to families to relationships, life, death, and health. I even became his companionship and took him to buy his clothes and help him with daily chores because he was the quintessential absent-minded professor. So, this is the role I was in when I showed up that day at his house. He had been avoiding me for 3 weeks, and I said I was coming with food. I never expected to see the scene that I did. I had not driven, and Richard did not want an ambulance, so I called an Uber. As we waited for the car to arrive, I stroked his neck and rubbed his shoulders, for his body seemed to need it. I had never touched that man in such a way. However, he sighed in relief and pleasure and collapsed into my arms. When the ride arrived, I all of a sudden thought, oh, crap. Because he had a hill for a driveway, and I'm a petite woman, and he's over 6 feet tall. I had to figure out how to get him on my shoulders and get him up the hill. We trudged up, only to find it was a compact car. I felt I was in a circus. I squashed this man in like a huge ball of yarn, and off we went to the ER. During the 15-minute ride, I warned Richard that the hospital would not let me stay with him unless we lied and said I was a relative. I suggested I be his niece. He readily agreed. We got there. They put him in an exam room. I said I was his niece. I was in the waiting room and asked that they get me as soon as they could. I waited and I meditated for his health as I felt my heart pound in terror. An hour passed, and they ushered me into Richard's exam room. He told me the doctors thought he had chronic heart failure and for me to start looking on my phone for treatment. I only too readily agreed, for I would do anything to keep this man alive. So for the next few hours, we searched the web until by 6 p.m., the doctors entered the room again. They said, "Mr. Taruskin, we need to speak to you alone." He said, "You can say whatever you want in front of her." Silence. They said, "Mr. Taruskin, you have stage 4 metastatic cancer. It is terminal." Time stood still. I had the pit of a lifetime in my stomach. Everything was surreal. Taruskin, in typical stoic fashion, listened to them and admitted himself to the hospital. He called his daughter to come, and I said I would come the next morning, and I went home to cry. The next day I arrived to find that his wife, who he had been separated from for 20 years, was in the room. Kathy did not know me, but when she found out I was best friends with Richard's most trusted student, she immediately opened up. I explained to her the events of the preceding day and offered to help in any way I could. Little did I know what that would mean until the following morning when I showed up. Then I encountered his cousin June, who had come from Los Angeles. She took me by the arm and said, "Let's go for a walk." Up and down the halls of the hospital we went, as she explained to me that the family was at a loss, for nobody knew how to deal with Richard, for nobody was close with him except for me. I knew his expectations, his needs, and had a relationship with the hospital, so I actually had to become part of the family and be a relative and help in the caregiving. I was honored, shocked, but I accepted, and thus I married my life to this man for the next 5 weeks. Richard was not going to go out without a fight. He had one last book to finish, and he needed 8 months. So he was going to do chemotherapy and radiation. However, the palliative care doctor had told me he had only weeks at most. It was heartbreaking for me to watch my friend go through those treatments. His body could not take the chemo. And then when it went to the radiation, it was just deafening to watch when 4 male nurses would come in with the stretcher, hoist him on like a beached whale, him in agony and his IV needles popping out. I could feel it in my arms as they would take him off to the radiation treatment, which he couldn't tolerate either. I'll never forget the last time Richard spoke to me or anyone. I had arrived one morning to find him silent and unresponsive. I decided to play for him a recording I had just received from a premiere of mine in Pennsylvania. Upon the end of the performance, Richard suddenly sat up and was the Taruskin we all knew so well. He described the piece in perfect detail and then congratulated me on my expert craftsmanship of the material. He called me by his beloved nickname for me, Belinda Choka. Then he collapsed, and he never said another word to anyone. Finally, after 5 weeks, the family and I had seen Richard deteriorate to the point that we all decided it was time to put him on compassionate care, which is a fancy way of saying no more treatments, no more sustenance, and the patient dies within 1 to 2 days. It was only me, Kathy, his wife, and his 2 grown children in the room. As we said goodbye, Richard gathered his strength and gestured wildly for me to come to his bed. He was in an oxygen mask, a tank in fact, but he took my arms, put them to his face, and mouthed the words, "My guardian angel." That's when I knew it was time to let my friend go.
You did great. That's amazing.